Welcome to Sleepy Harbor. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, let the pillow take the whole weight of your head, and let your eyes rest, whether they are open still or already closing. There is nothing you need to do for the next little while. Nothing to solve, nothing to carry, nothing to hold on to. You can let all of it go soft, because tonight I want to tell you something quiet and rather wonderful. Right now, in the slow settling of your body towards sleep, something is getting ready to begin. Not an alarm, not a task, not a worry. A shift is about to clock in. A whole crew of them, in fact, invisible and patient and endlessly competent, and they only ever work while you are lying still in the dark like this. The moment you truly drift off, they begin, and they work through the whole of the night, and in the morning you wake up, mended a little, without ever having lifted a finger to help them. Here is the first thing they do. Within about an hour of falling asleep, your body releases the single largest surge of growth hormone of your entire day. Not a trickle, not a background hum. The biggest pulse of the whole 24 hours poured out in one generous wave, and it happens down there in the deepest, heaviest stage of sleep, usually within that first hour after you slip under. Let me sit with that for a moment, slowly, because it is the heart of everything I want to walk you through tonight, and there is no hurry at all. Growth hormone is exactly what it sounds like, and also more than what it sounds like. Think of it as the body's master repair signal. It is the message that goes out to nearly every tissue you have and says, in effect, now is the time. Build, mend, replace what wore thin today. Grow, it is released by a small gland tucked at the base of your brain called the pituitary, no bigger than a pea. Sitting there quietly behind the bridge of your nose, and through the day that little gland keeps mostly to itself. But when you fall into deep sleep, it opens the tap, and out comes this flood of the repair signal, larger than at any waking moment you will have tomorrow. And here is the detail I find so strangely comforting, the thing I want you to carry down into sleep with you. That surge is not tied to the clock. It does not go off at 11 or at midnight because a schedule says so. It is tied to the sleep itself. Specifically, it is locked to the deepest stage, the one the sleep scientists call slow-wave sleep or deep non-REM sleep, or sometimes just stage 3. If you go to bed late, the surge waits for you. If you go to bed early, it comes early. It follows your sleep the way a tide follows the moon, faithfully, wherever you take it. Shift the deep sleep, and the great repair pulse shifts right along with it. It is waiting on you, not on the hour. So what is this slow-wave sleep, this deep place where the repair begins? Picture the surface of a lake. In the shallow stages of sleep, early on, the water is choppy. Little quick ripples crossing this way and that. That is your brain in light sleep, still busy, still near the surface. But as you sink deeper, the ripples smooth out and slow down and grow until they become long, slow, rolling swells, big unhurried waves moving all together in the same rhythm. Those are the delta waves. They roll through your brain at somewhere between half a cycle and 4 cycles a second, which is slow, the slowest and largest brain activity you will produce in the entire 24-hour day. Nothing you do awake, no calm, no meditation, no daydream comes close to this. It is a special kind of quiet that only the sleeping brain can reach, and it is precisely in that deep, slow, rolling quiet that the growth hormone comes pouring out. You have felt this without ever knowing its name. You know that particular sleep, the heavy one, the kind where if someone woke you, you would come up slow and confused and thick-tongued, not quite sure where you were or what year it was. That fog is the deep place. That is the repair shift in full swing. Your body has gone somewhere far down, somewhere it does real work, and it does not want to be pulled back up before it is finished. Now, what does that flood of growth hormone actually do once it is released? Because a signal is only useful if something acts on it, and here the body does not waste a drop. Growth hormone drives what is called protein synthesis. That is a technical way of saying it tells your cells to build. Proteins are the bricks and beams of you, the material your muscles and your skin and your organs are woven from, and building them is the everyday labor of staying alive. Through the day, you spend that material. You break a little of it down just by moving, lifting, walking, using yourself. And at night, on the growth hormone signal, the building crew comes in and lays the material back, brick by brick, replacing what the day cost you. It also drives cell division, which is simply the making of new cells to sit in for old ones. Everywhere in your body, cells wear out and need replacing, and the deep sleep surge is one of the moments the body chooses to do that heavy replacing. And growth hormone sends out a second messenger to carry the order further. It prompts the release of something with a long name, insulin-like growth factor 1, which everyone shortens to IGF-1. And you can think of IGF-1 as the foreman who takes the master signal and walks it out to the actual work sites in the tissue. Growth hormone shouts the order from the pituitary. IGF-1 carries it down to the muscle fiber, to the bone, to the skin, and makes sure the building actually gets done. The two of them together, growth hormone and IGF-1, are the axis the whole nightly repair runs on. Remember that pairing, because it comes back again and again as we walk through the sleeping body tonight. Wherever repair is happening, those two are usually behind it. And here is a small, lovely proof of all this, something you may have said yourself as a child or heard a child say without realizing you were describing real biochemistry. Children grow in their sleep. You have heard it 1,000 times. A child seems the same for weeks, and then one morning their trousers are suddenly short at the ankle, as if they stretched overnight. And the folk wisdom says, "Oh, they must have grown in their sleep." Well, it turns out that is not a charming figure of speech. It is literally, chemically true. That same surge of growth hormone in deep, slow wave sleep, the one flooding out of the pituitary within an hour of the child falling asleep, is the very mechanism that lengthens their bones and builds their small growing body. The growing genuinely happens during the deep sleep. The old wives were right down to the biochemistry. A child laid down small does, in a real and measurable sense, rise a fraction larger. And it is the night that did it, and the deep sleep specifically, and the great hormone pulse that only that deep sleep can trigger. There is something tender in that, I think. The body times its own growing for the hours of complete surrender. When the child has finally stopped running and fighting the day and has gone soft and still. Only then, in the deepest safety, does it dare to build. And though you are grown now, and your bones have long since settled to their length, that same crew still clocks in for you every night. It has simply moved from building you bigger to keeping you whole. Now, before we go any further down into the night, let me do two small things. The first is to ask you something, and I ask it gently, the way you might murmur a question to someone in the next bed. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? I always wonder. Somewhere it is deep winter and the frost is on the glass. Somewhere it is a warm night with the window cropped open an inch. A city where the last trains are running, or a quiet house at the edge of nowhere with only the wind for company. If you feel like it, and only if you feel like it, leave a word in the comments and tell me where you are. I like to picture the harbour filling up with all of you, from all your different corners of the earth, all drifting down toward the same sleep. And if you are new here, and you would like more of these slow journeys, you might quietly subscribe so the next one finds its way to you when you need it. And the second small thing is a promise. Tonight I am going to take you on a slow tour of your own sleeping body. Not a lecture, not a list to memorize, nothing you have to keep up with. Just a calm, unhurried walk through what is happening inside you. Right now, tonight, while you lie here doing nothing at all. We will follow the repair crew from the first hour to the last. We will visit the muscles and the skin, the brain and its hidden plumbing, the immune patrol and the heart finally allowed to rest. And you do not have to reach the end. That is the whole point of a place like this. You are welcome to drift off anywhere along the way, at any turn in the path, mid-sentence even. And the work will carry on inside you, whether you hear the end of the story or not. In fact, if you fall asleep before I finish, then I have done my job, and so has your body, and there is no better outcome than that. So let yourself go a little heavier now. You do not have to follow every thread. You only have to breathe, and let the sound of it carry you down. Let me lay out the shape of the night for you, the map of the whole territory, so that everything after this has a place to sit. Because sleep is not one flat thing. It is not a light switch, off and then on. It has a shape, an architecture, rooms you pass through in a particular order, and the order matters more than almost anyone realizes. When you fall asleep, you do not drop straight to the bottom. You go down in stages, like descending a staircase in the dark, one careful step at a time. First there is the lightest stage, that drowsy threshold where you are not quite awake and not quite gone, where a sound in the house can still pull you back and you might not even be sure you were asleep at all. Then a slightly deeper step, where the world outside begins to lose its grip on you, where you would no longer notice the murmur of a television in another room. And then down further into that deep, slow wave sleep we have already visited, the heavy place of the great delta waves and the flood of growth hormone. That is the basement, the deepest room, the one where the real physical repair is done. And then, having reached the bottom, you do something surprising. You come back up, not all the way to waking, but up through the stages again, and into a room quite unlike the others, a strange bright room called REM sleep. REM stands for rapid eye movement, because in this stage, behind your closed lids, your eyes flick and dart as though they were watching something, and in a sense they are, because this is the stage where most of your vivid dreaming happens. In REM, your brain is almost as active as when you are awake, buzzing and alight, sorting through the day, working over your feelings and your memories, while your body lies almost completely still, held gently in place so you cannot act out whatever you are dreaming. It is a peculiar, beautiful arrangement. The mind awake and racing, the body soft and unmoving, both at once. And then, from REM, you begin the descent all over again, down through light sleep, down toward the deep, and up again to another stretch of REM. One full round trip of this, down and back up, takes roughly 90 minutes. 90 minutes to cycle from the shallows to the depths and out into the dreaming and back. And across a whole night you will make this journey 4, 5, 6 times over. One cycle rolling into the next, a slow tide going out and coming in and going out again all night long without you ever having to steer. But here is the part I most want you to hear, because it is the secret at the center of tonight's whole story. These cycles are not identical. They are not simple copies of one another. The mixture inside each cycle changes as the night goes on, and it changes in a very particular direction. In the first third of the night, the early cycles, the deep, slow wave sleep is thick and long and generous. That is when your body spends the most time down in the basement, in the heavy repair rooms, the physical mending, the growth hormone flood, the building crew at full strength. All of it is front-loaded into those early hours after you first fall asleep. The body does its heaviest labor first, while it has the most to give. And as the night wears on toward morning, that balance quietly shifts. The deep, slow wave sleep grows shorter and shallower with each cycle, and the REM dreaming grows longer and richer to take its place. So, by the small hours before dawn, you are spending far less time in the deep physical repair basement and far more time up in the bright dreaming rooms where the brain does its emotional work, its sorting and settling of everything you felt and learned. The heavy bodily repair happens early. The mind's own housekeeping happens late. The night has a schedule, and it runs in that order every single time, without asking your permission. Sit with what that means for a moment, softly, as you sink. It means the most precious hours for physical repair. The hours when the growth hormone floods, and the muscles rebuild, and the deep waves roll, are the early ones. The first stretch of the night. The part that comes right after you lie down and let go. And it means something else, something I am going to leave with you now, like a small stone in your pocket, a thing to turn over as we go deeper. It means that when it comes to sleep, timing matters as much as duration. Not just how many hours, but which hours, and in what order. Because that heavy front-loaded repair window, the richest deep sleep of the whole night, is exactly the part that gets sacrificed when a night is cut short at either end. Lose the early hours, and you are not losing generic, interchangeable sleep. You are losing the deep sleep specifically. You are losing the repair shift at its fullest strength, the very flood we opened with. But that is a thread for later, held loosely for now. I only want you to feel its shape, resting there, so that everything the crew does tonight lands against it. Tonight, we are going to watch the repair shift do its work, hour by hour, room by room. The way it does for you every single night, whether you notice or not. So come back with me to the beginning, to that first hour, when you have just fallen asleep and the delta waves have begun to roll and the pituitary has opened its tap. Let us slow all the way down and watch what happens next, when the great signal reaches the tissue and the building actually begins. Because a signal, on its own, is only a message. The growth hormone and its foreman, IGF-1, go out across the sleeping body, carrying the order to build. But the order has to be received. Somewhere a muscle fibre, tired and faintly frayed from the day's use, has to hear it and act. Somewhere a patch of skin, a length of bone, a bank of quiet cells, has to catch the message and set to work. And that is exactly what happens, all through you, all at once, in the dark. Let me start with what most needs the mending, the tissue you spent most freely today without ever thinking about it. Your muscle. Every ordinary thing you did today cost your muscles a little. You do not have to have lifted anything heavy or run anywhere. Simply carrying yourself through the hours, standing, walking, reaching, holding yourself upright in a chair, using your hands, All of it puts tiny stresses through the fibers of your muscles, minute strains and micro tears too small to feel. This is not damage in any alarming sense. It is simply wear, the ordinary friction of being a living, moving body in the world. And like anything that wears, it needs mending, or over time it would simply run down. The mending is called muscle protein synthesis, and though it is a mouthful, it is a simple idea underneath. Protein synthesis, as we said, is the laying of the bricks, the building of new material. Muscle protein synthesis is that same building aimed at the muscle fibers specifically, weaving fresh protein into the frayed places, thickening what thinned, replacing what the day spent. And it runs up during sleep, lifted and fed by that same growth hormone and IGF-1 axis pouring out of the early deep sleep, and helped along by another quiet fact of the night, which is that you are not eating. Think about that for a moment. All night long, for these 7 or 8 hours, you take in no food. You are fasting, gently, without effort or hunger, simply because you are asleep. And that overnight fast tips your whole body into a different mode from the daytime. In the day, freshly fed, the body is busy taking things in, processing the meal, storing and sorting. But at night, with no meal to handle, it turns inward, toward maintenance, toward repair, toward putting the house in order, rather than answering the door. The fast is part of what frees the crew to work. The building of muscle rides on that shift, from a body busy digesting the day to a body quietly rebuilding itself in the dark. And this is the point in our tour where I have to show you the other side of the coin, gently. Because it is the first real proof of why any of this matters, of why the repair shift is not a luxury, but a load-bearing part of staying whole. There was a study of people trying to lose weight, dieting, cutting their calories, the ordinary difficult project of slimming down, and the researchers split them by their sleep. Same diet, same calorie cut, same amount of weight lost on the scale. The only real difference was that one group slept plenty and the other group had their sleep cut short. And when they looked closely at what kind of weight had actually come off, the two groups had lost very different things. The well-rested dieters lost mostly fat, which is what anyone dieting hopes for. But the sleep-short dieters lost far more of their muscle and far less of their fat for the very same drop on the scale. The pounds looked identical from the outside. Inside, they were opposite. The tired group was quietly eating into its own muscle to make up the difference, giving away the very tissue the rest of us are trying to keep, while holding stubbornly onto the fat. And the reason traces straight back to the repair shift. When the deep sleep is cut short, the great growth hormone flood is cut short with it, and the muscle protein synthesis, the nightly rebuilding, is blunted. The building crew is sent home early, and a body that cannot rebuild its muscle overnight starts to lose it. Two people lose the same 10 pounds. One loses mostly fat, the other mostly muscle. And the only real difference between them, the whole difference, was how they slept. There is a second thread here, tied to the same knot, and it is worth following slowly. One of the hormones that helps the body maintain and repair its muscle, particularly in men, is testosterone. And testosterone, too, keeps to the night. It rises through sleep and comes to its peak around the time of waking, built up in the dark, like everything else we have talked about. And in a careful study, healthy young men were restricted to only about 5 hours of sleep a night for a single week, just 1 week, and their daytime testosterone fell by something like 10 to 15%. In 7 nights of short sleep, these young men aged their hormone levels by what would otherwise take years. And with less of the hormone that helps hold muscle together, the body's balance tips a little further away from keeping and toward losing. I tell you these not to trouble you, here at the edge of sleep. Quite the opposite. I tell you because you are, right now, doing the good thing. You are lying down, you are letting the night come. You are giving the crew its full shift, the deep early hours it needs, the flood of the repair hormone, the rebuilding of everything the day wore thin. You are on the right side of that study tonight, simply by being here, simply by resting. The muscle you use today is, even now, being quietly woven back together, thread by thread, while you do nothing but breathe and sink and let the long, slow waves roll through you. And that is only the muscle, that is only the first room on the tour. There is so much more the night is doing for you, so many other crews already at their work in the dark, and we will visit each one in its turn, slowly, with no hurry at all. But feel this first, the great truth underneath all of it, the one I want you to carry down into the deep with you now. Your body is taking care of you. It always has. Every night of your life, without being asked, without being thanked, it has done this quiet, competent work, mending what the day cost, rebuilding you toward morning. You do not have to understand it for it to happen. You do not have to stay awake for it. You only have to let go and lie still and give it the hours it needs. So let your breathing slow a little more. Let the weight of the day loosen its hold, muscle by muscle, from your jaw and your shoulders and your hands. The building has already begun inside you. The great signal has gone out. The crew has clocked in for the night. And there is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do except to sink a little deeper into the dark and let the good work carry on. Let me tell you where that signal comes from, because it is worth knowing. In the drowsy way you know things at the edge of sleep. Deep in the center of your head, tucked beneath the brain, no bigger than a pea, there is a small gland called the pituitary. And within about an hour of your drifting off, as the very first stretch of deep sleep settles over you, that little gland releases the single largest surge of growth hormone your body will make in the whole 24-hour day. Not a trickle, a flood. The biggest one there is. Growth hormone. The name almost undersells it. Think of it less as a hormone and more as an instruction, a message sent out into the bloodstream that says, quietly and firmly, to every tissue it reaches, build. Repair, divide, grow. It tells your cells to knit protein back together, the very stuff your muscles and your organs and your skin are made from. It tells them to divide, to make new cells where old ones wore out. And it hands its message on to a second messenger, a molecule called IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, which carries the order deeper still, out to the tissues themselves, whispering the same simple word. Build, rebuild, grow, and here is the thing that makes me smile every time. You know that old phrase children have when they wake up and swear they are taller than they were the night before. I grew in my sleep, they say, as if it were the most ordinary magic in the world. Well, it is not a phrase. It is not a comfort a parent invents. It is simply true, and it is true because of this exact surge, this same flood of growth hormone locked to this same deep early sleep. A child grows in the dark, in the quiet, in the deep hours, because that is precisely when the signal to grow is strongest. The old wives were right. The body was doing its work all along, and we only gave it a name a very long time afterward. Wherever you are lying tonight, wherever in the world this voice is reaching you, I would love, in the morning, if you felt like it, for you to leave a word in the comments and tell me what part of the world you are drifting off in. There is something I find quietly moving about it. All these different rooms, all these different darknesses, all of us letting the same slow work happen. And if you are new here and you would like more of these slow nights, you can subscribe and there will always be another one waiting. But that is for the morning, that is for later. Right now there is nothing to press, nothing to do, only the tour to sink into, only the long walk down through the sleeping body that we have barely begun. Because there is a shape to a night, and it is worth understanding. In the loose and unhurried way you understand anything now. Sleep is not one flat thing. It is not a single dark room you close the door on and stay in until morning. It moves. It comes in cycles, each one lasting roughly 90 minutes, and inside each cycle you drift down through lighter sleep. Then down into the deep slow-wave sleep where the great repair happens, and then up again into the strange flickering country of dreams that they call REM. Down and up, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times across a night, like slow tides coming in and going out on a dark shore. And here is the part I want you to carry down with you, the small, strange truth that changes everything. Those cycles are not all the same. The deep sleep, the heavy, dreamless, slow-wave sleep, where the repair crew does its most serious work, is not spread out evenly across the night. It is front-loaded. It is packed into the first third, the early hours. The stretch soon after you first close your eyes. That is when the deep sleep runs longest and deepest. That is when the great hormone surges. That is when the building is heaviest. Later, toward morning, the balance tips the other way, and the dreaming sleep, the REM, grows longer and longer, and the night turns from the work of the body to the work of the mind. So the heavy repair, the muscle mending, the growing, the flood of the signal, all of it is concentrated early. The night is not a level field, it is tilted. The most important work happens first. And that is the quiet thing I want to leave open for you now, the thread that will run under everything else we visit tonight. We are always told the same simple number. Get enough hours. Get your 7, get your 8, as if sleep were only a quantity, a bucket you fill to a line. But it is not only a quantity, it is a schedule. It matters not just how long you sleep, but when in the night each kind of sleep arrives. Because if the heaviest repair is front-loaded into those first deep hours, then those first deep hours are not interchangeable with any others. They are the ones that carry the load. They are the ones that, when a night gets cut short, are so easily and so quietly lost. Timing, it turns out, matters as much as duration. Hold on to that, loosely, the way you would hold a smooth stone in your palm as you fall asleep. We will come back to it. We will see, later, exactly what it costs when those early hours go missing, and why the body cannot simply make them up. But not now. Not tonight. Tonight you are giving it all of them, the full early depth, the whole front-loaded flood, and the crew is working just as it should, right on schedule, in the dark, while you begin, at last, to let go. And the crew does not wait long before it turns to the muscles. There is a kind of work the body does during daylight that looks nothing like repair. You lift a weight, or climb a flight of stairs, or carry groceries up from the car, or simply sit at a desk for 8 hours with your back held at a slight, unnoticed angle, and in each of those small acts of ordinary effort you are creating tiny injuries. Controlled ones, intentional ones, in the case of exercise. The fibers in the muscle shorten and pull and are, at the microscopic level, stressed, not broken, not harmed in any catastrophic sense, but stressed in the way that a fine linen sheet is stressed when you pull it tight at the corners. The tension is there, distributed, and when you release it, the fabric settles slightly differently than it was before. The muscle is not a passive thing, it responds to use. And the response, the rebuilding, the laying down of new protein along the stressed fibers to make them a little stronger and a little more resilient than they were before the effort, almost none of that happens during the effort itself. Almost none of it happens while the day is going on around you and the demands are still arriving and the stress hormones are still circulating in your blood. The response happens at night. This is the gift that the growth hormone pulse makes possible, or rather the cascade that the pulse sets in motion. Because growth hormone, that master signal released in that enormous first surge during the first deep slow wave episode of the night, does not go directly to the muscles and do the building itself. It is more like the manager who clocks in first and then hands the actual work to the crew. The downstream messenger, the one growth hormone summons and instructs, is a molecule called IGF-1, which stands for insulin-like growth factor 1, and the name is worth sitting with for a moment because it tells you something about how the body works, this nested system of signals and responses, each one calling the next into action. Growth hormone rises. It travels to the liver. The liver responds by releasing IGF-1 into the bloodstream. And IGF-1 is what travels to the tissues themselves and says, in the chemical language tissues understand, now. Build. Now. Muscle protein synthesis is the technical name for what follows. The body takes the amino acids that arrived during the day from food that were circulating in the blood and waiting for exactly this moment, and it assembles them into new protein strands along the stressed muscle fibers. It fills the gaps, it reinforces the places that were strained. It adds, very slightly, to the capacity of the tissue so that it can bear a little more the next time. Think of it the way you would think of a rope bridge that sees heavy use by day. At night, the maintenance crew goes out and replaces the frayed strands, and when the bridge opens in the morning, it is very slightly stronger than it was the morning before. That is muscle protein synthesis, working as it should, under the conditions it requires, in the quiet hours, while you do not move and do not ask anything of the body, and the crew has the whole structure to itself. But there is something else happening at the same time, something quieter and equally important, which is that the very hormonal environment of sleep tilts away from breaking and toward building. During the day, cortisol, the body's primary stress signal, runs at levels that are necessary and useful for keeping you alert and able to respond. But cortisol is also what is called a catabolic hormone, which means it is, by nature, part of the machinery that breaks tissues down rather than builds them up. Catabolism is not a bad thing. The body needs both directions. It needs to break down old or damaged tissue, and it needs to build new. But the ratio matters enormously, and during the day, when cortisol is high and demands are continuous and the sympathetic nervous system is running the show, the ratio tips somewhat toward breaking. Sleep is where the ratio tips back. Cortisol begins to fall in the evening. By midnight, it is near the floor of its entire 24-hour range, sitting at its lowest point while you lie still in the dark, and it is in that trough, that quiet valley between the evening decline and the morning rise, that the building has the most room to happen. The anti-inflammatory, anabolic state, the state in which the body builds and repairs rather than breaks and prepares, has its longest, deepest window during the sleeping hours, and most of that window is front-loaded, again, into the early part of the night, when slow-wave sleep is deepest and the growth hormone pulse is at its strongest. So when someone talks about recovering from a hard training session, or from physical illness, or from any kind of bodily stress, and they say that sleep is when the real recovery happens, they are not speaking loosely. They are not using sleep as a vague synonym for rest. They are describing a specific, sequenced, hormonally orchestrated process that requires the absence of waking demands and the presence of deep sleep to run at full capacity. The recovery is literally sleep-dependent in a way that lying still in a darkened room while remaining awake is not, because it is the sleep itself, the specific neurological state, the delta waves rolling through the brain. The parasympathetic shift, the GH surge from the pituitary, the IGF-1 release from the liver, the cortisol trough, all of it together, that unlocks the repair state. Wakefulness, even quiet wakefulness, does not replicate it. And this has consequences that are worth pausing on, because they are surprising in a way that most people do not expect until they see the numbers. In a controlled study, researchers looked at what happened to people who were trying to lose weight while sleeping different amounts. Both groups were cutting the same number of calories. Both groups were losing weight. But the group that was sleeping less, getting roughly 5.5 hours per night instead of 8.5, lost significantly more of their weight from lean mass, meaning muscle, rather than from fat. The people sleeping longer lost significantly more fat and preserved their muscle. The total pounds were similar. The composition of what was lost was entirely different. And the mechanism is exactly what you would expect from everything described above. When sleep is cut short, the growth hormone pulse is blunted, the IGF-1 signal is weaker, the cortisol trough is shallower and shorter, and so the hormonal environment of the night shifts only partially toward the building state, while the breaking state keeps more of a foothold. The body, under those conditions, does not have the full signal to protect lean tissue, and so when it needs to find energy, it takes it from muscle as readily as from fat. You lose the weight, but you lose the wrong kind of weight. The night's repair crew, working a shortened shift in a building where the lights never fully went out, does less of what it was meant to do. Testosterone is part of this story too, though it is less often connected to sleep in the way that growth hormone is, and the connection is direct and measurable and worth knowing about. Testosterone in men. And testosterone plays a role in recovery and muscle maintenance in women as well, though the levels are different, follows a pattern across the night in which it rises during sleep and reaches its highest point of the day around the time of waking. It is not, in this sense, a purely daytime hormone, a signal that belongs to activity and exertion. It is also a sleep hormone, in the sense that sleep is the phase of the 24-hour cycle when it peaks, when the conditions for its production are most favorable, when the body is able to make the most of it. And in a study by Leproult and Van Korter, published in 2011, healthy young men who began the study with normal testosterone levels, men in their 20s, men who were not unwell or hormonally compromised in any way, were asked to sleep only about 5 hours per night for 1 week. Only 1 week. At the end of that week, their daytime testosterone levels had fallen by 10 to 15%. Not a small shift. Enough to push some of them into a range that would be considered clinically low in older men, and those young men reported feeling less energetic, less alert, less themselves, in ways that matched the numbers. 1 week of sleeping 5 hours. 10 to 15%. The body does not wait long before it begins to adjust to the signals it receives, and a shortened night is, in hormonal terms, a signal that the conditions for full repair and rebuilding are not available, and the body responds accordingly. These are the stakes, held gently, not to alarm, but because they belong to the same picture as the wonders. The repair crew clocks in when you sleep. The crew's efficiency, the quality and completeness of the work it can do, depends on the depth and the duration of the sleep. And when the sleep is cut, the crew works a shorter shift. In a building where the stress hormones have not fully quieted and the repair signals have not fully peaked, and what they leave undone accumulates in ways that are not immediately visible but are eventually measurable. Quick reminder: after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now, learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. But tonight, you are giving it all the hours. And so the crew moves, as it always does, from the deeper interior work outward, and eventually it arrives at the surface of you, at the largest organ you have, at the tissue that meets the world, that weathers the light and the weather and the contact and the friction of every single day. The skin. There is a reason the phrase beauty sleep exists, and the reason is not sentimental. It is not a polite encouragement or a piece of old women's wisdom that turned out to be more poetic than accurate. It is, in the specific and literal sense, a description of something the body does during sleep that it cannot do as well at any other time. And to understand it properly, you have to first understand something about the double life that skin lives, the way it operates as two entirely different things depending on the time of day. During the hours you are awake and moving through the world, the skin is, above everything else, a barrier. It is keeping things out. It is patrolling the border. Every molecule that tries to cross from outside to inside must get past it, and every harmful thing that arrives at the surface, ultraviolet radiation from the sun, microbes on surfaces you touch, the accumulated small injuries of friction and pressure and exposure, is met by a skin that is oriented toward defense. The cells at the surface are tightly packed and armored. The inflammatory responses are ready. The repair of damage is possible, but not primary, because primary, during the day, is protection. The skin cannot do everything at once, and during the day, protection comes first. At night, the calculation changes. When you close your eyes and the room goes dark and your body begins its descent into slow-wave sleep, the skin receives the same set of signals the rest of the body does: the falling cortisol, the rising growth hormone, the shift toward the parasympathetic, the tilting of the whole hormonal environment from alert to repair. And it responds by doing something remarkable. It shifts from barrier to workshop. The division of skin cells, mitosis, the process by which one cell splits into two, by which the worn surface of the epidermis is constantly refreshed by new cells rising from below, accelerates at night. The peak of epidermal cell turnover happens in the early hours, during and around that window of deep sleep that is already, as we have seen, so rich with repair signals. New cells are made at a rate that is meaningfully faster during sleep than during waking. The old, weathered surface cells are shed. Fresh ones take their place. This is not a metaphor. This is not the poetic sense in which sleep refreshes. It is the literal mechanical process by which the top layer of your skin is replaced. steadily, over days and weeks, by new cells made largely at night and made fastest in the hours of deepest sleep. The blood that reaches the skin changes during sleep as well. Blood flow to the skin increases, and with it comes an increased delivery of oxygen and nutrients, the raw materials of rebuilding. The skin flushes, very slightly. The surface temperature rises a fraction as the body redistributes heat, pushing it toward the periphery as part of the mechanism of cooling the core. And the blood vessels in the skin dilate to allow the heat to escape. This is not a side effect of sleep. It is part of the architecture. The body's core temperature needs to fall to reach and sustain deep sleep, and the way it achieves that fall is partly by radiating heat through the skin, which means the skin, during the night, is also serving as the body's thermostat, actively participating in the conditions that make deep sleep possible in the first place. And at the same time, something slightly unexpected happens at the surface itself. Something that sounds, at first, like a problem, but is actually part of the repair. The barrier becomes more permeable. Transepidermal water loss, the slow, passive movement of water vapor out through the surface layers of the skin, rises at night. The skin lets more water through. This might sound like a failure of the barrier, and in the strict defensive sense, it is a relaxation of it, but it is a deliberate relaxation, one that is part of how the skin does its overnight maintenance. The loosening of the tight seal between surface cells is what creates the conditions in which those cells can be renewed, in which the repair signals can move through the layers more freely, in which the whole workshop can operate. It is, again, the shift from defending to building, expressed at the cellular level, written into the permeability of the skin itself. All of this is invisible to you as you lie there in the dark. You do not feel your skin rebuilding. You do not feel the cells dividing, or the blood moving closer to the surface, or the water vapor rising through the outermost layers. But the evidence of this overnight work is visible and has been measured in ways that are quiet and specific, and sometimes a little startling. In a study published in 2010 in the BMJ, researchers led by Tina Axelsson showed photographs of people, the same people, photographed twice, to a group of observers who were asked to rate the faces. One photograph was taken after a normal night of sleep, one was taken after being kept awake for 31 hours. The observers did not know which was which. They rated the sleep-deprived faces as significantly less healthy and significantly less attractive than the same faces after proper sleep. Not slightly less. Not in a way that required close attention. The difference was legible to strangers at a glance, in the way faces always communicate health to the humans looking at them, even when those humans cannot articulate what they are seeing. What they were seeing, whether or not they knew it, was the surface that had been partly deprived of its overnight workshop, the skin that had not fully made the shift from barrier to builder, that had spent fewer hours in the repair mode, that had produced fewer new cells, received less fresh blood, done less of the slow, invisible work that accumulates across a lifetime of good nights into the visible difference between skin that looks alive and skin that does not. And the effects are not only acute, not only visible the morning after a single bad night, though they are that too. Research from dermatology, including a 2015 study by Oyatakin White and colleagues conducted through university hospitals, found associations between poor sleep quality over time and faster visible skin aging, and slower recovery of the skin barrier after it had been deliberately damaged. The skin of poor sleepers in that study took longer to heal, The barrier rebuilt itself less efficiently after disruption. The study was small, and it was partly supported by industry funding from Estée Lauder, and those are reasons to hold its specific findings with some care, to treat them as suggestive rather than definitive. But the direction of the finding is consistent with everything we know about the mechanism, with the nighttime peak of cell division, with the blood flow and the repair signals, with the simple logic that a workshop operating on shortened hours produces less finished work than one given the full shift. The detail from that single study sits within a framework that is well established, and the framework makes the direction of the result unsurprising, even if the precise magnitude of it deserves more investigation. Because this is the thing about beauty sleep that is easy to misunderstand. It is not a beauty treatment in the sense that beauty treatments are usually understood. Not something you apply from outside, not a product you layer onto the surface in hopes of making it better. It is instead the body doing the very thing that all of those products are trying to mimic or support. The cell turnover that anti-aging products promise to accelerate, the skin is already accelerating it. Every single night, in the early hours, driven by the same growth hormone pulse that is also rebuilding your muscles and the same cortisol trough that is also allowing your immune system to do its work. The delivery of nutrients and oxygen that serums are formulated to supplement, the blood is already doing that, flushing to the skin's surface in the warm, dilated vessels of the sleeping hours, delivering what was always meant to be delivered from inside. The barrier recovery that moisturizers are designed to support, the skin is already attempting that repair, laying down new cells and gradually reconstructing the tight junctions between them, working through the night toward the surface it will present to the morning light. Sleep does not make these things unnecessary. The relationship between the overnight repair and the products people choose to help their skin is more like the relationship between a well-rested worker and the tools they bring to the job. The tools can help, and they cannot substitute for the state of the worker. A person who sleeps well and uses nothing will generally age more slowly than a person who does not sleep and uses everything. The workshop needs to be open. The products, whatever their merits, can only assist a process that the body itself has to run. Testosterone supports this too, in the context of skin. Testosterone influences collagen production, among other things, and collagen is the structural protein that gives skin its elasticity and firmness, the scaffolding beneath the surface that determines how it holds its shape over time. The testosterone that rises during sleep, that peaks around waking, that falls measurably when sleep is chronically cut short, is part of the same network of signals that maintains the skin's architecture, that keeps the scaffolding from thinning too quickly, that preserves the relationship between the surface and the structure beneath it. When Leproult and Van Korter measured that 10 to 15% drop in testosterone after 1 week of 5-hour nights, they were measuring a shift not only in the hormonal environment of the muscles, but in the hormonal environment of every tissue that testosterone touches, which includes the skin. And so the skin sits at the junction of several of the night's repair systems, benefiting from the growth hormone cascade, from the testosterone level, from the cortisol trough, from the increased blood flow, from the relaxed permeability that lets the workshop run. It is, in this sense, a summary of the whole night written on the outside of the body, visible to anyone who looks closely enough, readable by strangers in a room even when no one has explained what they are reading. The face after a good night's sleep is the face of a body that has had its repair shift. The face after a short night is the face of a body that was pulled away from the work before it was done. There is something almost affecting in this. if you let yourself think about it quietly in the dark. The fact that the body wears its nights on its surface, that the invisible work of the sleeping hours becomes, slowly, inexorably, the visible evidence of a life, that the choice to give the workshop its full shift, to go to bed a little earlier, to protect the early deep hours when the crew is busiest, shows up, eventually, not in a number on a test or a reading on a machine, but in the simple human legibility of a face, in whether people look at you and see health, in whether the strangers in the BMJ study, looking at photographs they knew nothing about, chose one face over the other without being able to say why. Your skin is doing this now, as you drift. The blood is moving closer to the surface, the cells are beginning to divide, the old ones are being readied to be shed, and the new ones are rising from the deeper layers, guided by signals that your body is producing, not because you have asked it to or decided to. Not because you are conscious of any of it, but simply because you are asleep, and sleep is when this happens, and your body has known this far longer than you have been alive to witness it. The crew is working. The surface is being tended, and the face you will bring into tomorrow is being very quietly, very steadily, remade. You do not have to do anything. You are already doing everything that needs to be done, simply by being here, simply by allowing the night to be the night, by surrendering the hours to the dark and the silence, and the slow rolling waves of deep sleep that are, even now, carrying the body through its schedule, its precise and ordered sequence of repair. The muscles that worked today are being reinforced. The skin that faced the day is being renewed. The hormones that govern the whole process are moving in their rhythms, the cortisol at its floor, the growth hormone long since released in that enormous pulse in the first hour, the IGF-1 still circulating, still carrying its message to the tissues, still instructing the cells to build and divide and mend. The night is not half over. The work continues. And in a little while, when this movement of the night's tour completes itself and settles, we will move deeper still. Because the muscle and the skin are the tissues you can see and feel, the ones closest to the surface, the ones whose repair is visible in the way a face looks, in the morning light. But the night reaches further in than that. It reaches into the brain itself, into the sealed and busy interior of the skull, where a system unlike anything in the rest of the body is right now doing something that no one fully understood until very recently. Something that, once you know it, makes you think differently about every morning you have ever woken from a full night's rest and felt, without being able to say exactly why, clean. The muscle is the place to begin, because the muscle is where the night's repair is most literal, most physical, most easy to understand in the way that a thing being built is easy to understand. You move through a day. You carry weight, climb stairs, reach and lift and walk, and in doing all of that you introduce, at the microscopic level, small disruptions to the fibers that made the movement possible. Not damage in the catastrophic sense. Small disruptions, the kind the body expects, the kind it has always expected, the kind it has been solving every night for as long as the species has slept. And the solution is muscle protein synthesis. The quiet, continuous work of rebuilding those fibers, reinforcing them, making them fractionally more capable than they were the night before. This is what the GH pulse unlocks. This is what the IGF-1 carries forward into the hours after that first great wave of deep sleep has passed. The insulin-like growth factor 1 is still in circulation, still moving through the blood, still arriving at the cells with its instruction. Build. Repair, the overnight fast that sleep provides, the body no longer digesting, no longer routing energy toward the gut, shifts the whole metabolic balance toward reconstruction rather than processing. The resources go where the work is, and the work at this hour is the muscle. What is quieter and darker and worth sitting with for a moment is what happens when that work is interrupted. When the night is shortened, when the deep sleep is sacrificed to the early alarm or the late screen or simply the particular anxiety of a particular week that would not release its grip until 2 in the morning. In a controlled study, 2 groups of people were placed on identical calorie-restricted diets. The same deficit, the same number of pounds to be lost. And by the end of the study, both groups had lost roughly the same weight. But the group that had slept fewer hours had lost significantly more of that weight as muscle and less as fat. The group that slept normally lost more fat and preserved more muscle. The total on the scale was similar. What was underneath it was not. The night shapes what the body holds on to and what it lets go. And there is testosterone. In healthy young men, testosterone rises during sleep and reaches something close to its daily peak around the time of waking. It is part of the hormonal architecture of recovery and maintenance, part of what supports the muscle's ability to rebuild. A research team led by Rachel Leproot and Eve Van Korter restricted a group of young men. Healthy, young. Men who had no reason to expect what would happen, to 5 hours of sleep per night for 1 week. A single week. By the end of it, their daytime testosterone levels had dropped by 10 to 15%. Not an old man's slow decline, a sharp drop, measurable in blood, in young men, in 7 days, from nothing more than cutting the night short. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. And now we move inward, or rather outward, to the surface of the body. To the layer you can actually see in the morning mirror, the tissue that meets the world first and weathers it most visibly. The skin. It has its own shift. Epidermal cells divide and replicate at a rate that peaks in the early hours of the night. Hours when the body is deep in its repair cycle, when the cortisol is at its floor and the growth signals are still circulating. Cell turnover, the replacement of old and damaged cells with new ones, follows a circadian rhythm, and that rhythm places its highest activity here. In the dark, in the quiet, in the hours most people sleep through without knowing that anything is happening at all. The skin's barrier is also more permeable at night. Transepidermal water loss rises, the skin releases moisture more readily in sleep, and while that sounds like a vulnerability, it is also part of how the tissue breathes and rebuilds. The barrier opens slightly to do its work. Blood flow to the skin increases. The temperature at the surface rises a little, a reflection of the body offloading heat as it drifts deeper into sleep. And the blood that arrives with that warmth carries oxygen and nutrients to the cells that are quietly, methodically, renewing themselves. Beauty sleep is not a metaphor. In a study published in the British Medical Journal in 2010, a team led by John Axelson photographed the same people after a normal night and after sleep deprivation, then showed the photographs to observers who knew nothing about the subjects. The observers rated the sleep-deprived faces as less healthy, less attractive. The same faces, the same lighting, The same people, only the sleep had changed, and the difference was legible to a stranger's eye. What the skin had not been given time to do was visible in the morning, even to someone who could not have named the mechanism, who knew nothing of epidermal mitosis or transepidermal water loss or the nocturnal rise in skin blood flow. And yet the skin is only one surface, only one layer of what is happening inside you right now, in this moment, if you are already beginning to drift. Because while the epidermis renews itself and the blood delivers its quiet freight of oxygen and nutrients to the outer walls of the body, something else is happening deeper in, something that took scientists a surprisingly long time to find, partly because it only becomes visible when you look for it in the dark, in a sleeping brain, in conditions that are difficult to observe and harder still to interpret. It is one of the more remarkable discoveries in recent neuroscience. And it begins with a problem that the body solved long before anyone thought to ask the question. The rest of the body has a drainage system. Every tissue, every organ below the neck is threaded with lymphatic vessels, a parallel network alongside the bloodstream, thin channels that collect the waste produced by cellular activity, filter it, and carry it away. This is how the body clears out the metabolic debris of a day's work. The spent proteins, the byproducts of energy production, the cellular wreckage that accumulates whenever anything alive is doing anything at all. The lymphatic system is, in a sense, the body's sanitation department. It runs everywhere, except the brain. For reasons that remain not entirely understood, the brain has no lymphatic vessels of its own. It sits inside the skull, electrically alive and metabolically expensive. The brain consumes roughly a fifth of the body's total energy budget, despite accounting for only about 2% of its mass, and it generates waste continuously, the same way any organ does, the same way any machine does when it is running. But it has no dedicated drainage. The channels that carry waste away from every other tissue simply do not enter the skull. And for a long time, that presented a puzzle. The brain is the most active, the most metabolically demanding structure in the body. How does it take out the trash? The answer, it turns out, switches on when you close your eyes. In 2013, a team led by Mike and Nedergaard published research in the journal Science describing what they called the glymphatic system, a word built from glial cells, the support cells of the brain, and lymphatic, for the function it performs. Working in mice, the researchers found that the brain has its own waste clearance mechanism, and that it works in a way no one had anticipated. Cerebrospinal fluid, the clear liquid that already surrounds and cushions the brain and spinal cord, is pumped along channels formed by the outer walls of blood vessels, driven through the spaces between brain cells, and then collected and drained away, carrying with it the metabolic waste the neurons have produced. It is essentially a slow power wash. A current of fluid moving through the architecture of the brain itself, collecting everything the cells have left behind. And here is the part that matters most for this particular night. This particular moment of beginning to let go, the glymphatic system does not run at full capacity all the time. It is not continuous. It is not on while you are sitting at a desk or walking through a building or having a conversation. It is, in the most meaningful sense, a night shift operation. In the sleeping mice in Nedergaard's lab, glymphatic flow was dramatically higher than in the waking ones, and the reason was structural. During sleep, the spaces between brain cells, the interstitial space, the gaps in the architecture, expanded by roughly 60%. The brain's tissue opened up. The gaps between neurons widened, and the cerebrospinal fluid moved through those widened passages far more freely, far more quickly, sweeping out far more of what had accumulated during the day's relentless activity. Think of it this way. During the day, the city is crowded. The streets are full, the passages narrow, the flow of everything slow and difficult. Goods pile up at the edges, the delivery trucks can barely get through. Then, at night, the streets empty. The crowds go home. And suddenly, the channels that were constricted all day open wide, and the vehicles that couldn't move freely before can do their work, collecting, clearing, carrying away. The city wakes up to clean streets. The brain wakes up to something similar. Among the substances the glymphatic system clears is a protein called beta-amyloid. The name may be familiar because beta-amyloid is one of the proteins that accumulates in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. It clumps into plaques, forming deposits that are associated with the progressive damage of the condition. The connection between sleep and this clearance mechanism is not yet fully established in human beings. The Nedergaard work was done in mice, and while the mouse brain and the human brain share many fundamental properties, the translation between animal model and human physiology is always something to hold with a degree of care. The mechanism is compelling and well supported in the animal data. The human picture is still being filled in. But what is already visible from the human side is suggestive. In 2018, a team led by Eshan Chokri-Kajori used PET imaging, a scanning technique that can track specific molecules in the living brain, to measure beta-amyloid levels in healthy human volunteers after a night of normal sleep and after a single night of sleep deprivation. The sample was small. The study was one night, not a lifetime of disruption. These are real limits, and they matter. But the finding was this: just one night without sleep was enough to produce a measurable increase in beta-amyloid in the brain, concentrated particularly in the regions most vulnerable in Alzheimer's, the hippocampus, the thalamus, areas that play central roles in memory and awareness. One night, not a chronic pattern, not years of disruption. One night of sleep withheld, and the next morning the waste was still there. What you cannot conclude from this, what the science does not support, and what no responsible reading of these studies should suggest, is that a single bad night causes Alzheimer's disease. It does not. The relationship between sleep, amyloid clearance, and long-term neurological health is complex, incompletely understood, and almost certainly not linear in any simple way. But what the research does suggest, in the tentative, hedged, and careful language that careful science uses, is that the clearance mechanism is real, that it operates preferentially during sleep, and that its absence, even briefly, leaves something behind that the brain would prefer to have removed. The plumbing exists. Sleep is when it runs. That much, at least, the evidence supports. For now, in this hour, in the dark, the glymphatic current is moving. The spaces between your brain cells have opened in the way that only sleep allows, and the fluid is passing through, collecting what the day deposited. It is quiet work. You will not feel it. You will not know it is happening. But it is happening nonetheless, and it has been happening every night of your life. This slow and methodical maintenance of the most complex structure the body contains, running silently behind the closed door of sleep. And the brain is not the only thing standing down its guard at this hour. There is another system engaged in night work, one that gets spoken of in general terms so often that the specificity of its operation is easy to miss. The immune system. Not the broad idea of it, not the vague reassurance that sleep is good for immunity, but the actual, named, mechanical sequence of events that takes place in your body when you sleep. Because what happens is not passive. It is not simply that the immune system benefits from rest the way a tired athlete benefits from sitting down. What happens is active, and what triggers it is the falling away of something that was holding the immune system back all day. Throughout your waking hours, two hormones circulate at levels that are, by the standards of the night, relatively high. Cortisol, which you have already met in the context of its midnight trough, the stress hormone, the alertness and arousal signal, the substance that primes the body for demands, and adrenaline, which carries its own name from the gland above the kidney that produces it. The epinephrine of activation, of readiness, of the sympathetic nervous system's constant background hum through the waking day. Both of these hormones are necessary, both serve genuine purposes. But they have a side effect on the immune system that is important to understand. Certain immune cells, T cells, the lymphocytes that are among the most precise and targeted soldiers in the body's defensive arsenal, have a property that cortisol and adrenaline suppress. That property is adhesion, the ability to stick. T cells find infected cells, cells that have been taken over by viruses or bacteria or other intruders, and they bind to them, adhere to them, and destroy them. But for that binding to happen, the T cell needs to make contact, needs to grip the surface of the compromised cell in a way that cortisol and adrenaline, at the concentrations present during waking hours, tend to inhibit. The stress hormones dial down the stickiness. They keep the T cells mobile and circulating, which has its own uses during the day, but they also reduce their killing efficiency. Then night comes. Cortisol falls to its nadir around midnight. Adrenaline drops with it. And the T cells, freed from that chemical suppression, become more effective. Their adhesion molecules are expressed more strongly. Their ability to grip infected cells and do their work is unshackled. In 2019, research published by Stoyan Dimitrov and colleagues documented this mechanism with a clarity that had not been available before, showing directly at the molecular level that the stress hormones active during waking hours suppress a specific class of adhesion molecules on T cells, and that in the absence of those hormones during the biochemistry of sleep. Those molecules are expressed more readily, the sticking happens more efficiently, and the targeted immune response is stronger. It is not that the immune system is inactive during the day. It is always working, always monitoring, always patrolling. But the night shift is different. The night shift is when the patrol can finally work without the chemical interference that the demands of waking life impose on everything. It is when the T cells can do the thing they were designed to do most fully, because the hormones that were necessary for everything else, the alertness, the readiness, the capacity to respond to the demands of a waking day, are finally, briefly, out of the way. And alongside the T cells, other aspects of the immune system change in the dark. Cytokines, the signaling molecules that immune cells use to communicate, to coordinate, to call for reinforcements and direct the body's response to threat, shift in their levels and their action during sleep. Two of particular relevance are interleukin-6 and TNF, tumor necrosis factor, both of which are involved in the inflammatory response that is the immune system's way of mobilizing against infection and building the kind of response that will last. Their patterns of production across a 24-hour period are not random. They are timed, and sleep is part of what drives that timing. part of what ensures that the immune action happens when the body's other systems have cleared the field for it. There is also something that happens in sleep with respect to memory. Not the memory of words and faces and days, but the immune system's own memory. When your body encounters a pathogen and mounts a response, it does not simply fight the invader and then forget it. It produces memory cells, long-lived immune cells, that carry the record of what the pathogen looked like, how to recognize it, how to respond faster and harder if it appears again. This is the basis of immunity in the lasting sense, the reason a childhood infection leaves you protected decades later, the reason vaccines work. And the consolidation of that immune memory, the laying down of that long-term record, happens in ways that parallel, in their underlying logic, the memory consolidation that happens in the brain during sleep. The body uses sleep as the time to file and store what it has learned about the threats it has faced in the immune system, just as the brain stores and organizes the experiences of the day. The practical consequence of this is something you can hold in your hand and examine, because it has been put to a direct test. In 2015, Arik Pratha and colleagues at the University of California ran an experiment that is difficult to forget once you have encountered it. They recruited healthy adults, measured how much each person was sleeping over several days using wrist monitors and daily diaries, and then administered nasal drops containing a live rhinovirus, the class of virus responsible for the common cold. The participants were kept in a hotel for 5 days, and the researchers watched to see who actually got sick, who developed the infection, who did not. People who had been sleeping 7 hours or more were considerably less likely to develop a cold. People sleeping under 6 hours were approximately 4 times more likely to become infected than the well-rested group. Not somewhat more likely. Not marginally more vulnerable. 4 times. In an experiment where everyone received the same dose of the same virus through the same method, in controlled conditions, the primary variable that predicted who got sick and who did not was how much they had been sleeping. 4 times. That number has a way of sitting quietly but insistently in the mind, because we tend to think of the immune system as something either intact or impaired by illness itself, by stress in a general way, by the obvious extremes of sickness or exhaustion. We do not always think of it as something we are continuously either maintaining or degrading by the simple nightly decision. Not always a decision, sometimes a circumstance, sometimes an imposition of how many hours we allow ourselves to sleep. But the cold study makes this concrete in a way that abstractions do not. It is not a correlation in a large data set where many confounding factors compete for explanatory space. It is a controlled experiment with a direct exposure, a measured outcome, and a result that is stark. Sleep under 6 hours. Rhinovirus drops in both nostrils, 4 times more likely to be ill by the end of the week. The shield is not metaphorical. It is measurable. It is tested. And it goes to work every night, if you let it. What happens to that shield in the particular context of a vaccine is, if anything, even more direct. When you receive a vaccine, you are receiving an education for your immune system, a carefully prepared introduction to a pathogen's signature, delivered in a form that can provoke an immune response without causing disease. The body mounts that response, produces antibodies calibrated to recognize and neutralize the real threat, and stores the memory of what it has learned. This is the whole mechanism. And the consolidation of that learning, the antibody production, the encoding of the immune memory, happens on a timescale that extends beyond the moment of injection. The night after, the nights following. The sleep that comes after a vaccine is part of the process of making that vaccine work. Studies examining what happens when that sleep is disrupted found something arresting. People who were sleep-deprived the night after receiving a hepatitis vaccine or an influenza vaccine produced markedly fewer antibodies than people who slept normally. Not slightly fewer. In some of the work from the laboratories of Corinne Spiegel and Eve van Korter, the difference was substantial. Sleep deprivation the night after vaccination appeared to roughly halve the antibody response compared to what normal sleep produced. The dose was the same. The vaccine was the same. The person was the same. The sleep was different, and the immune outcome was dramatically different. This is not a small or marginal finding. Vaccines are one of the most effective tools in the history of medicine. The ability to produce a strong antibody response is not an abstract measure. It translates directly into how well protected a person actually is. And the research suggests that a significant portion of that protection is built during sleep, in the days and nights following vaccination, as the immune system consolidates what it has been shown and writes the memory of it into long-lived cells that will recognize the threat for years or even decades. Sleep is not the supplement to vaccination. Sleep is part of how vaccination works. And then there is something that many people have experienced and perhaps wondered about, without knowing the mechanism behind it. The bone-deep exhaustion that comes with illness. The way a fever or an infection does not merely make you feel sick, it makes you feel desperately, irresistibly sleepy. The way the body seems to be pulling you toward the bed with a kind of urgency that has nothing to do with effort or emotional tiredness. The way that sleeping, really sleeping, during an illness feels like the most natural thing in the world, even if the sleep itself is troubled or fragmented. This is not coincidence. It is not simply that illness is tiring, that fighting an infection depletes energy and leaves the body exhausted in the way that any great effort depletes energy. The pull towards sleep during sickness is, in a very precise sense, orchestrated. The same cytokines, the same interleukin-6, the same TNF, and other immune signaling molecules that the immune system uses to coordinate its response to infection also act on the brain. They cross the blood-brain barrier or signal through pathways at its borders, and they influence the neural circuits that regulate sleep. They are soporifics. They make you sleepy. The immune response does not merely benefit from sleep as a passive condition. The immune response actively induces sleep because the immune system and the sleep system share chemical messengers, and because the body, at the level of its deepest regulatory logic, has learned that sleep and immunity are not separate. They are coupled. They speak the same molecular language, and one can speak to the other, can send a signal that crosses the gap between them and says, "Stop. Go still. Let us have the resources and the time and the biochemical conditions that we need to finish this." When you are ill and overwhelmingly, inexplicably sleepy, it is because your immune system has sent a message to your sleeping brain, and your sleeping brain is responding to it. The weakness, the heaviness, the surrender. All of it is the body routing its available energy away from movement and cognition and toward the immune response that needs every resource it can be given. Your body is not failing you when it forces you to bed. It is doing something extremely deliberate. It is making a choice about allocation, and sleep is what it has chosen as the condition most favorable to fighting what is trying to harm it. This is why the old instruction, "sleep it off," is not simply comfort. It is, in a real sense, correct, not because sleep is a passive rest that allows the body to recover from exhaustion, but because sleep is an active state that the immune system requires in order to do its most important work. The patrol is most fully empowered at night. The immune memory is most efficiently consolidated in sleep. The T cells are least constrained by the stress hormones that suppress their stickiness during the day. The cytokines that coordinate the adaptive response follow rhythms that are structured around the sleep-wake cycle. And when the body is fighting something, it reaches for sleep the way a craftsman reaches for the best tool available. Because it is the best tool available. Because the chemistry of sleep and the chemistry of defense are not separate departments, they are, in the most fundamental sense, the same ongoing project, running through the same building, staffed in part by the same signaling molecules, and most efficient when they run together. So when you come down with a cold and take yourself to bed early, when the fever lifts slightly toward morning after a long night of sleep, when the sore throat that was sharp and intrusive at midnight feels marginally less urgent by 8 in the morning, some portion of that easing is the work of the night patrol, running its course, doing what it was designed to do, in the conditions that allow it to do it best. The improvement is not only the passage of time, it is what the hours of sleep made possible. And here, if you are still following this, if your eyes are still open and the words are still reaching you through the dark, here is a thought to hold lightly before the next part of this quiet tour begins. What the immune system does at night is not merely defensive, it is also a form of learning. The body meets a threat, mounts a response, and then uses the chemistry of sleep to consolidate what it has understood, to write the encounter into a kind of memory that will last far longer than the illness itself, that will be available to the immune system years later when the same threat appears again. Sleep is when the lesson is filed. Sleep is when the record is kept. And that consolidation, that long-term immune memory, is part of what makes you, over a lifetime, increasingly resilient to the things the world keeps sending toward you. Every night of good sleep is not only a night of repair. It is, in some small but genuine sense, a night of becoming more capable of surviving whatever comes next. The work, as always, continues without interruption, without ceremony, without any signal that you could hear, even if you were listening. The cerebrospinal fluid moves through the opened passages of the brain. The T cells adhere with a grip they could not quite manage in the cortisol bright hours of the afternoon. The cytokines circulate and signal and organize. The immune memory takes shape, slow as a tide and just as reliable, filing the body's experience of the world into the long archive that keeps you standing. And somewhere deeper in the night, in the hours that belong to the second half of sleep, another kind of quiet has been gathering. The brain is doing something the rest of the body cannot quite replicate. It has no lymphatic vessels threading through its tissue the way the liver and lungs do. No conventional drainage to carry away the day's molecular residue. No obvious channel for the waste that accumulates in the interstitial space, the narrow, fluid-filled gaps between the cells as the neurons fire through the hours of waking. For a long time it was not entirely clear how the brain managed what every other organ managed with dedicated plumbing. The answer, when it emerged from a series of experiments published in 2013 by Lulu Xie and her colleagues, was not what anyone had expected. What happens during sleep, in the mouse brain at least, is this. The glymphatic system, a kind of shadow infrastructure, built partly from the sheath cells that surround blood vessels, the cells called astrocytes, becomes dramatically more active. The space between the brain's cells, that interstitial gap, expands. In the sleeping animals, it expanded by roughly 60% compared to the waking state. 60%. As if the brain, in deciding to sleep, was quietly pulling back from itself, opening room that had not been there an hour before, allowing the cerebrospinal fluid that bathes the organ to push through more freely, to reach places it could not reach when the cells were pressed close together in the busy configuration of daytime. And what the fluid carried out with it, washing through the open channels and out toward the body's drainage, included beta-amyloid, the protein that, over decades, aggregates into the plaques associated with Alzheimer's disease. This is not a minor footnote in the story of what sleep does for the body. It is something closer to the reason the brain sleeps at all. The glymphatic flush is the brain's version of the repair and clearing work happening everywhere else, in the skin, in the muscles, in the marrow of the bones, but directed at something the brain accumulates in a way no other organ quite does: the chemical debris of its own extraordinary activity. Every thought, every decision, every conversation and worry and moment of attention leaves a molecular trace. Sleep is when the trace is washed away. In people, a study published in 2018 by Ahsan Shokri-Kojori and colleagues used PET imaging to look at what happened to beta-amyloid levels in the human brain after a single night of sleep deprivation. The sample was small, and this was not a study to overload with conclusions it cannot carry. But what the imaging showed was consistent with the mechanism. A single missed night was enough to raise detectable beta-amyloid in the brain. Not proof of long-term consequence, not a settled verdict on what this means for years and decades. A mechanism, glimpsed through a narrow window, suggesting that the clearing work is not optional, not something the body stores up and does later. It happens, or it does not happen. Each night its own accounting. This is, in some ways, the most intimate thing sleep does. Not the muscles rebuilt or the skin renewed, those you might almost imagine as external, structural, the body maintaining its architecture. This is the brain, quietly cleaning itself of its own thoughts. And then there is the immune system, moving through the same night with the same unhurried competence. You have already come this far in the tour. You know by now that cortisol finds its lowest point of the day near midnight, that adrenaline falls with it, that the suppression those hormones normally place on a key adhesion mechanism, the grip by which T cells lock onto and destroy infected cells, is finally lifted. Work published by Stoyan Dimitrov and colleagues in 2019 put a precise mechanism to what sleep does for this particular action. The adhesion molecules that allow T cells to bind to their targets are inhibited during the day by adrenaline working through specific receptors. When adrenaline falls during sleep, that inhibition lifts. The T cells become more effective killers, not because sleep has somehow manufactured new immune capability, but because it has removed the chemical brake that daytime stress places on the system. The cytokines organize in parallel. Interleukin-6 and TNF, tumor necrosis factor, shift their patterns during sleep in ways that support the adaptive immune work, the kind of immunity that is not merely defensive in the moment, but instructive over time, the kind that teaches the body what it has survived and prepares it for what might come again. What this means in practical terms was demonstrated with a cleanness that is rare in biology. In a study led by Arik Prather and published in 2015, participants were given nasal drops containing rhinovirus, the kind of virus that causes a common cold. Those who had been sleeping fewer than 6 hours a night were approximately 4 times more likely to actually develop a cold than those sleeping 7 hours or more. Not slightly more likely. 4 times. The virus was the same. The exposure was the same. The immune system receiving it was not. The vaccination finding runs in the same direction. People who received a hepatitis B vaccine or an influenza vaccine and then slept normally produced markedly more protective antibodies than those who were sleep-deprived in the days around vaccination. In some experiments, the difference was roughly a doubling of the antibody response. The vaccine provides the encounter. Sleep is when the lesson is written into long-term memory. Without the sleep, the encounter is partly lost. The immune system saw the threat and failed to file the record properly. There is one more thing, and it is perhaps the most elegant of all the connections in this part of the story. You have almost certainly felt it without knowing its name. The heaviness that descends when you are ill. The way the body seems to insist, with an authority that overrides ordinary plans, that you must lie down, that you must rest, that you cannot continue. This is not weakness. It is a signal, and it travels along the same molecular pathways that connect sleep and immunity. The cytokines that the immune system releases during infection, interleukin-6 among them, are some of the same signaling molecules involved in sleep regulation. The body, when it senses a pathogen and begins to mount its response, routes energy toward the immune work and simultaneously increases the drive towards sleep, because sleep is where the immune work happens best. Feeling wiped out when you are sick is the body correctly identifying the most useful thing you can do and compelling you toward it with a force that is difficult to refuse. The fatigue of illness is the immune system borrowing the controls. And now, the heart. It has been working since before you were born. It has not stopped once, not for a moment, not through the years of childhood, or the long days of adulthood, or the restless nights, or the still ones. It pumps somewhere between 60 and 100 times every waking minute, pushing blood through a network so vast that if you laid every vessel end to end the line, would circle the earth more than twice. It does this without your asking. It does this when you are frightened, and when you are calm, and when you are sitting at a desk, and when you are arguing, and when you are eating, and when you are staring at nothing in particular, and it does not get a break. Not in the way that the word break actually means. But there is something that happens during sleep. Something that is not quite a break, but is as close to one as the heart ever comes, and it happens quietly. In the first deep passage of the night, when the slow-wave rhythms are rolling through the brain and the body is beginning its long repair. Your heart rate falls, not gradually, the way it drops when you sit down after a walk. It falls with intention, guided by a shift in the balance of the nervous system that is one of the most important changes sleep makes to the whole body. During the day, your autonomic nervous system, the part that runs all the functions you don't consciously control, exists in a state of ongoing compromise between two competing influences. One of them is the sympathetic branch, which you probably know by its effects: the raised heart rate, the sharpened attention, the glucose flooding into the blood, the sense of readiness. This is the system that mobilizes you for demands, large and small, and it is active to varying degrees for most of the waking day, because waking life makes demands. The other influence is the parasympathetic branch, sometimes called rest and digest, which does the opposite of everything the sympathetic branch does. It slows the heart. It lowers blood pressure. It draws blood to the digestive organs and away from the muscles of flight and fight. It is the system of recovery, and during slow-wave deep sleep, it wins. Not dominates in some violent takeover, but wins, quietly and completely, in the way that silence wins when a conversation finally ends. During deep REM sleep, the sympathetic nervous system falls to its lowest activity of the entire 24-hour day. The lowest. Not of the quiet afternoon, not of the restful Sunday morning spent reading, but of the whole cycle. And as it falls, the parasympathetic system assumes a dominance it cannot achieve at any other point, and the heart feels this. Heart rate drops, in healthy sleepers, by somewhere between 10 and 30% below the resting waking level. For a person whose heart beats 70 times a minute at rest, that might mean 50 beats a minute during deep sleep. 50. Each beat slower and fuller and less urgent than the ones that carried them through the day. There is a word in cardiology for the quality of the heart's action during this time, and it is something close to efficient. The heart in deep REM is doing less with less, because it has been given permission, for the first time in the day, to do less. And with the slower heart comes the slower blood pressure. During waking life, blood pressure fluctuates constantly, moment to moment, responding to posture and emotion and exertion and the ambient stress of simply being a person in the world. But over the course of a normal night, something measurable and important happens. Blood pressure dips. In healthy people, the drop is roughly 10 to 20% below daytime levels, and this dip, this quiet nocturnal descent, is not a side effect of sleep. It is one of its functions. The cardiovascular system is using the hours of sleep to rest in a way that has real protective consequences for the vessels and the heart itself. Cardiologists have a name for the people whose blood pressure does not do this. They are called non-dippers. Their blood pressure during sleep stays close to their waking levels rather than declining, and the difference in outcome is not trivial. Non-dippers carry measurably higher risk of cardiovascular events than those whose pressure falls normally at night. The nocturnal dip is not merely incidental, it is, in some sense, the point. The heart and the vessels that carry its output need that window of reduced pressure to recover from the demands of the day, to repair the small stresses that accumulate in arterial walls, to give the whole system a chance to operate at something other than full load. The nighttime dip is the heart's maintenance window, and when it doesn't happen, the repair does not fully occur, and the cost accumulates. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because we tend to think of rest as something passive, something that simply happens when demand stops. But the nocturnal dip is an active achievement. The body constructs it. The nervous system shifts its balance to make it happen. The heart participates. And it happens on a schedule, predictably, night after night, in the same early window of deep slow-wave sleep, in a coordination that has been running since infancy. REM sleep is different, and it is worth knowing why. When the brain enters REM and the dreaming begins, the autonomic balance shifts again. Heart rate and blood pressure become variable. They move with the dreaming content, sometimes surging, sometimes falling, fluctuating in patterns that mirror the kind of variability you'd see in mild waking activity. Heart rate variability, the slight beat-to-beat variation in the time between heartbeats, which is itself a marker of cardiovascular health, shifts considerably across the night, reaching different patterns in deep REM than in REM. The cardiovascular rest that matters most for recovery is concentrated in the early deep sleep periods, not evenly distributed across the night. REM gives the brain its window, deep REM gives the heart its. And as the night continues and the cycles turn, a third change is happening alongside the slower heart and the lower pressure. Core body temperature, which began falling before you went to sleep, a drop that was itself one of the signals that drew you towards sleep in the first place, continues its descent and reaches its lowest point of the entire 24-hour day somewhere in the second half of the night. The lowest. Not early evening, not the cool pre-dawn, but deep in the sleep itself, in the metabolic quiet of the night's second half. And this matters because temperature is not merely a byproduct of metabolism, it is a governor of it. As the core temperature falls, the body's overall energy demand falls with it. The whole system throttles back. Less fuel burned, fewer processes running at full speed. More resources available for the repair and maintenance work that requires energy to conduct but is not urgent enough to compete with the demands of an active, moving, thinking, interacting, waking person. The sleeping body is not merely resting, it is redistributing. It is routing the energy and the attention of its biochemical machinery toward the things that could not be prioritized during the day, and it is doing so in the context of a metabolic slowdown that makes the redirection possible. And in that quiet, in that slowed and deliberate dark, other systems begin their own work. Cortisol has been falling since early evening. During the day, cortisol rises in the morning, sharply, in what is called the cortisol awakening response, a surge that helps pull the body into wakefulness and readies the immune and metabolic systems for the demands ahead, and then it declines gradually through the afternoon and the evening, reaching its lowest point somewhere around midnight. That trough, the deep valley of the cortisol curve, is not accidental. Cortisol in high concentrations is a suppressor of many of the body's repair and immune functions. It is designed to do that. In acute stress, it makes sense to divert resources away from long-term maintenance and toward immediate survival. But in the sustained low state of midnight cortisol, with the stress signal withdrawn and the sympathetic nervous system quieted, the body finds the chemical permission it needs to tip toward repair. The low cortisol, low adrenaline environment of deep sleep is the specific biochemical context in which the growth hormones surge, the immune patrol, the tissue mending, all the work described in the hours before this moment, can proceed without interference. Cortisol's trough is not the cause of sleep's repair work. It is the condition that allows it. And alongside cortisol, something else. Melatonin, which the pineal gland, a small pinecone-shaped structure buried near the center of the brain, began releasing into the bloodstream when darkness fell. Melatonin is most commonly thought of as the timing signal for sleep, the hormone that tells the body the sun has gone down and the night has begun. That coordinates the many internal clocks of the body's circadian system. And it does do that. But melatonin is also, chemically, an antioxidant. Oxidative damage, the cellular wear and tear caused by the reactive oxygen molecules that are a normal byproduct of metabolism, accumulates during waking activity, and antioxidants are part of the body's ongoing response to that accumulation. Melatonin, circulating through the blood in the hours of darkness, may be patrolling against some of that damage at the cellular level as repair proceeds. The case for melatonin as a meaningful cellular antioxidant in the living human body is still being developed, but the chemistry is real and the timing is suggestive. The body's primary nighttime hormone is also built to protect its cells in the dark. And then there is the deeper housekeeping, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that has no felt signal, that most people have never heard of and yet depends, in part, on the same overnight fast that sleep provides. Every cell in the body runs a process that biology calls autophagy. The word means, roughly, self-eating, and while that sounds alarming, the reality is the opposite of alarming. It is one of the most elegant maintenance processes in the body's entire repertoire. Cells accumulate damaged proteins, worn-out organelles, misfolded molecules, molecular debris that builds up over the course of metabolic activity the way sediment builds at the bottom of a river. Autophagy is the process by which the cell identifies this debris, packages it, and disassembles it, recycling the components for reuse rather than letting the damage accumulate. A cell that can't run autophagy properly is a cell that ages faster, that functions less well, that becomes a source of the dysfunction that underlies many diseases. A cell that can run it is a cell maintaining itself from the inside, quietly, without any action on your part. Autophagy is regulated partly by the body's circadian clock, the same internal timing system that governs sleep and waking, and it is favored by the fasting state. When the body is not digesting and processing food, when insulin is low and the metabolic signals of eating have subsided, autophagy can proceed more freely. Sleep, which is for most people a period of extended fasting, provides exactly that window. The overnight fast is not merely a pause in eating, it is, at the cellular level, an invitation for cleanup. The repair happening at the tissue level, the muscle fibers, the skin, the bone, has its cellular analogue in the autophagy running quietly inside each cell, recycling what is worn and making room for what is new. And bone. Bone seems like a fixed thing. You carry it as a scaffold, and it feels like stone, and it is easy to imagine it as inert, as something laid down in youth and simply persisting. But bone is one of the most dynamic tissues in the body, perpetually in a state of managed demolition and reconstruction. Two cell types share the work. Osteoclasts are the demolition crew, cells that dissolve old or damaged bone matrix, making space and releasing the minerals locked inside. Osteoblasts are the builders, cells that lay down new matrix, that mineralize it, that construct the dense, organized structure that gives bone its strength. These two processes run constantly, simultaneously, in a balance that determines whether a given bone is gaining density or losing it over any period of time. And this balance follows a circadian rhythm. The markers of bone formation and resorption rise and fall across the 24-hour day in patterns that track with the sleep-wake cycle and the disruption of sleep, chronic short sleep, shift work. The irregular schedules that misalign the body's internal clock is associated in large population studies with lower bone mineral density. The evidence here is observational. It shows association, not a simple one-way chain of cause and effect. But the rhythm is real, and it is reasonable, given the broader pattern, to understand the night as also being, in some quiet sense. When the bone builders have their best window, when the conditions of low cortisol and available growth hormone and the other night repair signals create an environment that tips the balance toward construction rather than dissolution. And the metabolic system, which does not pause but does reset. Insulin sensitivity, the responsiveness of the body's cells to insulin's signal to take up glucose from the blood, is not fixed. It changes from day to day, and one of the things that changes it is sleep. Researchers gave healthy volunteers a single night of partial sleep restriction and measured their insulin sensitivity the next day. Even one disrupted night produced a measurable reduction in insulin sensitivity. The cells were less responsive to insulin's signal. The blood glucose handling that the body carries out thousands of times a day in response to meals was less efficient. The body's sugar management resets overnight, and when the overnight is cut short, the reset is incomplete. This is not a dramatic effect from a single bad night, and the body has some resilience. But it is a real effect, documented under controlled conditions, and it fits within the same pattern that runs through every system discussed so far. The night is when things are put back in order, and the putting back requires the time. So let us take a breath here. Let us hold for a moment the picture that has been building since the beginning of this night. Within about an hour of falling asleep, the pituitary released its greatest growth hormone surge of the entire day. That surge set the muscle fibers to rebuilding and the skin cells to dividing. The immune T cells, freed from the cortisol and adrenaline that kept them from fully adhering during the day, moved to the walls of the blood vessels and began their patrol. The cytokines orchestrated the immune memory, filing away the encounters of the past and building the responses that will matter in the future. The glymphatic channels in the brain widened, and the cerebrospinal fluid moved through, carrying the day's metabolic waste out through the body's drainage and away. The heart slowed. The blood pressure fell by a fifth and stayed there, giving the vessels their maintenance window. The core temperature sank to its lowest point in the full 24 hours. Throttling the system's energy demand so resources could be redirected. Cortisol bottomed out near midnight, and in its absence, the repair environment deepened. Melatonin moved through the blood in the dark. Autophagy ran inside each cell, quietly dismantling the day's debris. Bone remodeled on its ancient rhythm. Insulin sensitivity prepared to restore itself. This is not a passive state. This is not the absence of function. This is the body's busiest shift, running on a schedule so precise, so carefully sequenced, that the most critical work, the growth hormone pulse, the early immune surge, the deep in-REM repair, is concentrated into the first third of the night, because evolution learned. Over millions of years of living things sleeping in dangerous environments, to front-load the work that matters most. And this is where the darker part of the story lives. Because if the heaviest work is front-loaded, then what you lose when you shorten a night is not evenly distributed across everything. What you lose is disproportionately the beginning. When a night runs to 5 hours, or 4, or 3, whether by choice or by demand or by the particular cruelties of modern life that erode sleep from every edge, the first thing that is lost is the last part of the night, which is to say the later REM cycles, the morning emotional processing, the brain's second pass at the day's experiences. This is real loss. But the repair crew that clocked in during that first hour of deep sleep, that crew ran. It got something done. When nights are chronically short, not occasionally, but week after week, month after month, something more insidious happens. The body's repair capacity does not simply adjust downward to match the shorter window. It shifts. The biochemical balance tips from the building state, the anabolic state, the state of protein synthesis and tissue construction and immune memory and insulin sensitivity restoration toward the opposing state. The catabolic state, the breakdown state. Sleep loss raises evening cortisol, not just slightly, measurably, consistently. in ways that begin to look like the cortisol profile of chronic stress. And elevated cortisol in the evening is exactly the opposite of the low cortisol repair environment that the night is supposed to provide. The repair shift has been not merely shortened but disrupted at the hormonal level. The very conditions that allow the repair crew to work have been dismantled. Testosterone in men, which normally rises during sleep and peaks near waking, fell by 10 to 15% after a single week of restricting sleep to 5 hours per night in healthy young men in the research of Leproult and Van Korter in 2011. 10 to 15% in 1 week. Testosterone is not merely a symbol of male health. It is one of the primary signals that maintains muscle mass, supports recovery from physical stress, and keeps the body's tissue maintenance programs running. A 15% drop in a week, from something as simple as consistently cutting sleep to 5 hours, is a shift that the body feels, even if the person experiencing it cannot name what they are feeling. The hunger hormones flip. In research published by Spiegel and colleagues in 2004, people who slept less showed measurably lower levels of leptin, the hormone that signals fullness, that tells the brain the body has enough, and higher levels of ghrelin, the hormone that signals hunger, that tells the brain to eat. The short sleep body is not merely tired. It is chemically inclined to eat more, because its hormonal state has shifted toward one that expects scarcity and responds by increasing appetite and decreasing the signal of satiety. The weight that accumulates with chronic short sleep is not a failure of willpower, it is the body responding correctly to a signal its hormonal system is sending. A signal that says, "We are not getting what we need, eat more." The cognitive effects are equally stark, and they are stranger than most people expect. Because one of the most unsettling features of accumulated sleep debt is that those who carry it tend not to know how impaired they are. In a study by Van Dongen and colleagues in 2003, people whose sleep was restricted to 6 hours a night for 2 weeks accumulated cognitive deficits by the end of the period that were as severe as those seen after total sleep deprivation, after staying awake for an entire night. Their reaction times, their attention, their performance on tasks of sustained vigilance were as compromised as someone who had not slept. But their subjective sense of sleepiness had leveled off. They reported feeling, by the end of the 2 weeks, not that tired. They had adapted to their impairment without recognizing it. They felt functional. They were not. And if you want a number that makes the cost of accumulated sleep loss concrete and a little arresting, Dawson and Reed in 1997 measured what happens to reaction times as people stay awake for increasing hours and compared the results to alcohol consumption. After 17 to 19 hours without sleep, reaction times and lapses of attention resemble those measured at a blood alcohol level of roughly 0.05%, the threshold of legal impairment in many countries. After 24 hours, the resemblance is to 0.10%, above the legal limit for driving in most of the world. The point is not that sleepy people and drunk people are the same. It is that the impairment is real, it is measurable, and it is of a magnitude that we recognize immediately as significant in one context, while often dismissing it in the other. To cut the night short is not to lose a few hours of rest. It is to cancel the repair shift. It is to send away the crew that arrived in the first deep hour and to return the body to the conditions of breakdown rather than construction. The muscle fibers that needed rebuilding go unfinished. The immune memory that needed consolidating is not fully written. The blood pressure that needed its nightly drop stays elevated. The cortisol that should have fallen stays high. The growth hormone that should have surged is attenuated. And the whole system, which was designed to spend its night in a state of quiet, competent self-restoration, instead moves through another cycle of the catabolic shift, breaking down a little more of what the building state had made. And here is the thing that is easy to miss when you are looking at any one of these systems in isolation. The repair that happens at night is not a collection of separate, unrelated processes that happen to share a time slot. It is a coordinated program. Growth hormone triggers protein synthesis, which rebuilds muscle, which is also served by the testosterone that peaks toward morning. The immune system's T-cell patrol is enabled by the same cortisol fall that permits the skin repair. The glymphatic flush depends on deep sleep, which is also when the GH surge happens, which is also when the cardiovascular rest is deepest. The cellular autophagy that runs during the overnight fast overlaps with the period of lowest metabolic demand, the lowest body temperature, the lowest energy expenditure. These are not coincidences. They are the signatures of a system that was not engineered by a designer, but was assembled over vast spans of time into a coherent whole. A whole in which the sleeping hours became the maintenance hours, because sleep provided the conditions that made all the maintenance possible at once. The body is not resting while you sleep. It is working, and working hard, and working with a precision that no conscious act on your part could replicate or improve upon. You bring to this the same thing you brought when you were an infant, the willingness to close your eyes and let the process run. That is all it requires of you. So now, at the end of this long, slow tour through the sleeping body, through the first deep sleep surge of growth hormone, through the muscle fibers rebuilding on the GH and IGF-1 signal, through the skin dividing and renewing in the small hours, through the glymphatic flush widening its channels and washing the beta-amyloid away, through the T-cells finally freed to patrol, through the immune memory being written into the permanent record, through the heart slowing and the blood pressure falling and the temperature descending to its daily minimum, through the cortisol trough and the melatonin and the autophagy and the bone quietly remodeling in the dark. What is left to say is really only this. Your body has been doing this for you every night of your life. Before you knew the word cortisol, before you had heard of growth hormone, or the glymphatic system, or the nocturnal blood pressure dip, or the parasympathetic nervous system, before any of these things had names that you could say aloud, the process was running. The repair crew clocked in. The heart slowed. The brain flushed. The immune system patrolled. The skin divided. The bone remodeled. Night after night, in the dark, without any supervision, without any instructions from you, the body did what it had learned to do over the span of hundreds of millions of years of animals sleeping through the night. It fixed itself. There is a particular kind of comfort in understanding a process you had always suspected but never fully seen. The folk wisdom that surrounded sleep, the sense that it was more than mere unconsciousness, the recognition that people who slept well looked better and healed faster and got sick less often and somehow seemed more capable of meeting the demands of their days, was not superstition. It was observation. It was the accumulated noticing of people who had watched the effects without having the language for the mechanisms. Now there is language. Now there are the mechanisms. And the mechanisms only deepen what the folk wisdom already knew. Sleep is where the repair happens. Not because the body has nothing else to do with the time, but because sleep is the only context in which the repair can fully proceed. The cortisol has to fall, the adrenaline has to quiet, the sympathetic nervous system has to yield. The deep, slow wave rhythms have to arrive, measured in their half-cycle heartbeats of 4 seconds and more, rolling through the cortex like the tide coming in across still water. Only when those conditions are present can the growth hormone pulse. Only when the cortisol is gone can the T cells adhere. Only when the heart has slowed and the blood pressure has dropped and the temperature has descended can the full maintenance window open. The sleeping body is a body that has been given the conditions it needs to take care of itself. And it does. Every time. Quietly and completely and without any intervention from the conscious mind that will wake, hours later, unaware of what was done on its behalf in the dark. You are right now in some position of stillness or near stillness. Your breath has likely slowed a little as this hour has gone on. The sounds around you, if there are any, have probably receded to the background in the way that sounds do when attention has partly left the room. Somewhere in the hours ahead, your body will begin its work. The first passage of deep sleep will come, and with it the growth hormone will move through you, and the skin cells will divide, and the heart will slow to its quiet minimum, and the blood pressure will fall. And somewhere in the middle of the night, the cortisol will reach its lowest point and hold there while the repair proceeds, and the bones will continue the long, slow dance of demolition and reconstruction that has been running in your skeleton since before you were old enough to know you had one. None of this requires your attention. None of it requires your effort. It requires only that you allow the hours to pass in the dark. If you are somewhere in the world tonight where the sky has gone quiet and the lights are low, perhaps you can feel the first suggestion of that descent already. The way the body begins to loosen its grip on the day. The way thoughts move a little less sharply than they did an hour ago. The way the weight of the hours just past is already beginning to lift and soften into something less insistent. If you feel moved to share where you are listening from tonight, please do. These stories come back to life in the comments, knowing that someone in Oslo or Nairobi or Auckland or a small town whose name I wouldn't recognize found their way here in the dark and let the night close in around them. That matters, and I read what you leave there. There are more stories here of the same slow and careful kind. The same long walk into something true and quietly astonishing about the world or the body or the deep past. They will be waiting whenever you want them. But for now, for tonight, there is nothing more to know. You have followed the body through its full night shift. You have seen the crew clock in and the work begin, and the systems quiet themselves in the beautiful, purposeful way that only sleep permits. You have done enough for one day. Put down whatever remains of it. Let the heart find its slower rhythm. Let the temperature fall. Let the cortisol sink toward midnight and stay there. Let the process begin that has already been waiting for you on the other side of waking. You're moored safe in the sleepy harbour now. Drift off.